what does this mean for the citrus industry? Like, are there other varieties of orange that can withstand the citrus blight? Are there other places where we are safe for now?
One of the industry events I went to, there was a guy there from Minute Maid, which is obviously owned by Coca-Cola, and he said that 3 or 4 years ago, the Minute Maid juice product was 80% Florida oranges and 20% from elsewhere, so mostly Brazil. And now, this is 3 or 4 years later, 80% of the product is from Brazil and 20% is from Florida. What's happened is that, for a lot of reasons, it's cheaper and easier to grow it in Brazil. The disease is less threatening there, and they do that. They put it on tankers. They send it up to Florida, and Florida is a storage facility, and maybe they mix in a couple of Florida oranges just so they can say it's a partially an American product, and that's what orange juice looks like now.
We're live in the Situation Room with Alex Salmon, who is a features writer at Slate, who recently wrote an incredibly viral piece on orange production collapsing in Florida, which is something that is a little personal to me because I grew up in South Florida, and the near peak of orange production was right about when I was born, 2003, 2004 winter, so a year before I was born. And it has been in total secular decline since then, and production has dropped like 95% as of the most recent winter. Um, and we used to go camping every winter at this place in Central Florida, like rural Central Florida, Lake Wales, right next to a big citrus citrus grove and orange juice plant. And you could really tell, year after year that the groves are just kind of suffering. So, Alex, welcome to MTS.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Of course. So, what happened with the citrus groves?
It's a great question. Yeah, sort of like, it's set out to try and answer. The sort of top line story on this is always, or has been at least, that citrus greening, the disease, is the culprit that has really just demolished the Florida citrus industry, Florida orange juice specifically. Um, and citrus greening is really bad and does exist and, is a real problem. And, the state of it is extreme. Like I spoke to a ton of people who work in the industry, and every person was like 100% of orange trees in Florida have citrus greening, which is effectively a terminal illness. There are things you can do to treat it short term, but it's not curable at this point. And so that's sort of, that is, I think, the favored culprit at the moment. It's responsible for a lot of the acute decline we've seen lately, but also there's a lot under the surface there. So, there it didn't go on its own. There wasn't one. I guess there wasn't one culprit. In fact, there's a lot of sort of financial stuff and the housing market and hurricanes, and we can get into it obviously, but a lot beneath the surface that sort of caused that collapse to happen.
So, housing market, I do want to get into that. Um, Definitely a phenomenon of Florida over the last 20, 30, 40, really over the last 100 years has been building out lots of suburbs. Um, is that what you mean by sort of threats to citrus groves?
Totally. Yeah. So, yeah, Florida housing market extremely interesting, right? And like part of the reason I think oranges are so fascinating in Florida is it's as much a social history of the state as it is a story about any one crop or any one economic activity. And as Florida's economy has changed, this is the sort of phase change we've seen specifically away from citrus and towards the real estate sector, extremely powerful, right? And I think you're wise to put it on a 100-year time scale, because we've also seen the Florida real estate sector, take down the global economy more than one time over the course of 100 years, right? It's an extremely potent sector on the upside and on the downside. And yeah, so the more I talked to people and the more I went around, like, that was a story that I kept hearing, was that, citrus greening shows up in Florida in 2005 effectively. That's when we sort of see the effects of it. Um, but the date that I kept hearing was 2007, and especially in the Lake Wales area, which you reference, like, um, that's an area where there has been a ton of development. Like, this land that was citrus groves is all being turned into housing, and the merits of that we can discuss. And I think that there are good reasons and bad reasons, and Florida has seen a ton of growth, and you have to put people somewhere. Just the reality of where they're putting them is, this land that these oranges grow on is relatively cheap. It's easy to build on. It's largely deregulated, and so these housing giants that are building, what I think we would just call suburban sprawl, right? It's not the sort of like hot, dense infill sort of development that is, I think, favored by urban planners. It's like, pretty cheap, quick, high margin housing. That stuff's all going in places where, there were orange groves, years ago, like or months ago even. It's really rapidly changed.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me actually of here in California, where the South Bay of the Bay Area, San Francisco, used to be known as the Valley of Heart's Delight because they grew all kinds of fruit there. It was full of apple orchards, for example. Apple, the company, is a reference to that. And then it was just totally taken over by like infill suburban development. And now there's basically no orchards left because it's all suburbs. And the suburbs themselves are like the most expensive, highest land value suburbs on earth. Um, but like surely like Florida has lots of land, right? Like, Lake Wales is super rural. There
Yeah,
should be tons of room for orange groves.
yeah, you would think that, but I mean, think about how the Florida housing market has changed, right? Since, there's obviously been a lot of people moving to Florida, especially since COVID. I mean, a lot of these trends are really, we've only seen them since COVID, both in terms of the steepest decline of the orange industry and a lot of this development, which is extremely recent history. But, the coastline in Florida is extremely expensive, right? It's like to get that land, to get housing there, it's super pricey. It's like California. And it's also expensive to insure, right? That's the other component of this is because of the hurricanes and the sort of climate peril. It's just expensive to live there. So what's left? Well, Lake Wales, the whole ridge in Florida, the central Florida down the middle, the only part that was never underwater, um, that's where the orange industry is. And now it's also like, well, that's the cheapest place to get land. And part of the reason it's cheap to get land is because all the orange growers are massively underwater, not literally, but financially, because the industry has gone so topsy-turvy. So, you have sort of distressed owners of large tracts of land, and you have developers with incentives to build, and there's an appetite for it. It seems like, I mean, this is one of those things where you have to track that census data closely and see, is this sustained interest? Is this a situation that's going to have echoes of, 2007 where it got overbuilt and there wasn't, enough solid financing and, we know how that story goes, right? So yeah, it's a really interesting place, but specifically Central Florida, far from the coast, has been, all of a sudden there's a ton of interest and pressure on that area to develop.
So was the citrus screening like a Chinese psyop or a bioweapon? Some people say that it was, some say that it wasn't. What did you find?
Yeah, it's an interesting suggestion. There have been citrus greening obviously comes from China. There have been other diseases prior to greening that were, less existential. Citrus canker also came from China. Big issue in the 80s and 90s. Did it come from China as a bioweapon? I didn't see any evidence of that. And I think part of the reason I would feel pretty confident in saying that is because greening has been around everywhere for 120 years. This is not like a novel disease. And it's been in China, obviously, where oranges came from originally. Also, it's been in Brazil and India and California. It's been around. It didn't really sneak up on us. Only in Florida has it been an extinction level threat. So it's something that, is specific to the Florida orange industry itself. And I think that the sort of scientific literature on this would point to herbicide and pesticide usage, certain land use practices, monocropping, and some other stuff that was really specific to the way Florida's citrus growers chose to build out that capacity. And for a while, that was super effective. They were producing astounding amount of oranges and orange juice and everything else, and then not so much.
Kind of funny. This is literally the plot of Interstellar, right? Like
Yeah,
they
great
have they
point.
have this blight disease that incurably kills like crop after crop, and they need to find a new planet where they can do agriculture again.
And
So
it's
that's
it's
that's kind of
amazing.
funny.
Yeah, totally. It's a great point of reference. I mean, it's amazing too because really as you go through some of the reporting and the science and the various outlook on citrus greening as it arrived, there was like no sense that this was going to be the thing that knocked the whole industry out, right? It was like it showed up Florida citrus growers are very used to bugs and pestilences and maladies of all sorts, right? And it was like, oh, surely we'll solve this. Like someone will find something that will solve this. And then it just got worse and worse and worse. And there were solutions that came up that seemed like they were the silver bullet. And then it turned out, tree steaming was one of them. Didn't work. Back to the drawing board. And now, it's however many years, 20 years, and every single tree has this. It's
So if
amazing.
citrus greening was not the only cause, if it was also um, like as you said, it was land use, it was pesticides, stuff like that. Why wouldn't we have been able to attack those other causes?
It's interesting because, yeah, there were a lot of them, and they're coming from all different angles. I mean, I think a big part of this also is sort of the arrival of international capital and Wall Street in the Florida citrus industry. Like that's a big change, and that happens in the '90s. And so, you know, like I was really interested in like when do we see these declines start to happen? And as you wisely pointed out at the beginning of this, um, 2003, 2004 is the peak of orange production in terms of millions of boxes. But in terms of processing plants and processing centers and packaging plants and stuff, we see the peak sort of in like the late 80s or the 70s even, and that's before the Wall Street money gets involved. And once Wall Street gets its hands on these processing centers or on Tropicana or on packaging plants. You know, the numbers, as I recall, at some point there was 88 packing centers for fresh fruit in Florida. Now there are eight, and this is like this is way before greening. This is way before any of this. The processing centers we went from 53 to four, and that's even an overstatement of how much action is going. Like the Citrasuco plant, that's just cold storage now. That's just stuff that they're running up from Brazil, orange juice that's grown and processed in Brazil and then shipped to the US for cold storage. So, those four plants that exist, one of them is boutique, and the other three are only running one shift, and they used to
Why did
run
so
three
many plants
shifts.
shut down? And when did they shut down?
Yeah, that happens like largely through the 90s is when that really picks up. And part of that is
So
the arrival.
before the yields started going down.
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So,
Why?
once you get the Wall Street crew in there, they, the Wall Street outlook, is getting rid of redundancies and inefficiencies and stuff that costs you money. And so they start shutting down these plants because it's excessive to have them. You can go through sort of the history, the Florida citrus, the official history that the state keeps up, and these mile markers are very funny. You see Brazilian firms buying up, in '96, Brazilian firms really start buying up these processing plants, and then as you follow the news on them through the local media, they're all getting shut down. It's like it's much easier to process the stuff in Brazil because it's cheaper, so they shut these plants down, and the margins are up, so it looks good on paper as an investment product. And so, the infrastructure goes first, and that stuff was happening because I think in a large part because of the Wall Street money or the global capital that showed up in Florida at that time.
Hmm. So what does this mean for the citrus industry? Like, are there other oranges, other like varieties of orange that can withstand the citrus blight? Are there other places where we are safe for now? Is it going to like kill all of the oranges in the same way? The I forgot what disease it was. It was some kind of fungal infection, I think, killed all of the Gros Michel bananas that were like the banana of the 1950s, and now we have an entirely different kind of banana.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that everything is on the table at some level. The right now what's happened basically is that, California produces more oranges than Florida does, which I think, if you're a Floridian, is sort of a staggering turn of events. Just you just wouldn't think that that was possible not that long ago. But really, like the industry has relocated to Brazil, and Florida citrus as it exists is sort of a handmaiden for the Brazilian industry. And like I spoke with a number of people. One of the industry events I went to, there was a guy there from Minute Maid, which is obviously owned by Coca-Cola, and he said that 3 or 4 years ago, the Minute Maid juice product was 80% Florida oranges and 20% from elsewhere, so mostly Brazil. And now, this is 3 or 4 years later, 80% of the product is from Brazil and 20% is from Florida. So, you know, what's happened is that for a lot of reasons, it's cheaper and easier to grow it in Brazil. The disease is less threatening there, and they do that. They put it on tankers. They send it up to Florida, and Florida is a storage facility, and maybe they mix in a couple of Florida oranges just so they can say it's a partially an American product, and that's what orange juice looks like now. And that could that's I think that's where the trend line is pointing. I don't think Florida, if Florida has a citrus industry, it'll be much like we're seeing now. It's pretty boutique, pretty small, and certainly complementary to the Brazilian industry, which is pretty much the only game in town now.
Mm. So James Fishback is a candidate for the Republican nomination for Florida's governor's race. He is a little controversial, a little Groyper adjacent, but one of the main sort of pillars of his campaign is bringing back the Florida orange. His logo is the orange, even as sort of orange branding has faded among the Floridian political elite. Do you think this is like a message that's going to have like real pull with voters, or do people like kind of not care? And do you have any other takes on Fishback's orange pilledness?
Yeah, it's an interesting. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he's proposing like $1 billion purse prize for anyone who can cure greening, and I've seen him talk about frost proof, which is the sort of it's almost like the ghost town of the Florida citrus industry. It was like the place where, the dynasties of Florida citrus once incorporated and existed, and now is a town of, 3,000 people. There, there are very few oranges to be seen there. There's no active processing, no packaging plants. Like, in fact, they just passed a proposal in Florida to tap into the aquifer there and use the groundwater to facilitate residential growth elsewhere. So it's really been passed over. And I think hearing Fishback talk about frostproof is really interesting to me, just as part of Florida's social history and everything else. I think it's an interesting. I think it raises a lot of interesting questions about like how what kind of economy Florida is going to have, right? What does the Florida of the future look like? And is there any place for this? Because it's a very much a changing of the guard socially. The class structure of Florida. Citrus had a lot to say about that not that long ago, and it's a different Florida now. And I think that as real estate and finance and all these things that have grown, and taken sort of the catbird seat in the Florida economy. I think it's worth raising those questions. I'm not so familiar with Fishback's platform beyond that, but I think it is really interesting that it's played a role in that primary.
Yeah, so Fishback's policy proposal on this was, yeah, you're right. It was $1 billion purse prize to any scientist who develops a greening resistant citrus strain. But it is sort of culturally interesting. I think the difference between, Florida is a red state, kind of like how California is a one party state. So the real election is the Republican nomination, and the um, Fishback's sort of vibes are sort of the opposite of the Republican frontrunner Byron Donalds, where Fishback sort of poses himself as like part of the rural revival of like bringing back old Florida. We're going to bring back the oranges. We're going to bring back all of our small towns. We're going to protect the Florida environment. Well, he said something like, if you want like AI data centers, if you want Miami to turn into Dubai, then vote for Byron Donald. So it's definitely it's kind of two visions for the future of Florida and more broadly the future of America, really.
Totally. It's a really, I mean, I think, you know, as goes Florida, so goes the country at some level, right? I think Florida has a lot to say about, the United States in general, and obviously it's one of the great growth and development stories of the 2020s, it seems like, and yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. I think what's interesting is that it felt like you could weigh those two options and those two visions and say, like we're going to make an active choice. Um, and I think that the Florida citrus industry, the oranges specifically, have collapsed so dramatically in the last couple of years that that decision is maybe already being made, and it may be hard to even go that other route, even if the voters do say, we like the fishback vision, we want this agricultural component of Floridian society to continue apace. It might already be too late for that, and I think it's a really interesting question to consider.
Totally. So, speaking of sort of declines and changes in American culture and industry and fortunes, One that has been talked about a lot recently is like the death of Hollywood. Like, now AI is becoming a thing, which may be net good or net bad for the industry. It's not clear. But before that, even sort of jobs in the entertainment industry in Los Angeles have been declining for some years now. So, do you have any takes on the death of Hollywood?
Yeah, it's interesting. That's it's a little out of my wheelhouse. I think, you know, it's funny because these things do happen, right? These things go through cycles. Obviously, it's funny that we're sitting here talking about, California's orange industry is doing great and California's entertainment industry is doing, you know, sort of terribly. And then on the flip side, we're talking about Florida's orange industry is uh is facing an extinction event, and some of those white collar industries are doing a lot better. It's funny how things go, and yeah, it's I think it's actually, again, it's interesting at some level to think like Florida, I think, was looked like it might be on a different development path than California for a while, right? It's a low or no tax state. It sort of had this different vision of, cheap land and cheap inputs, um and the way it's developed is actually very similar to California now. Like we're seeing, instead of there being orange groves, you'll just have a cul-de-sac that's named after the family that grew oranges there, like Apple
Hmm.
in the South Bay or whatever. It's the exact sort of type of development. And that's interesting to me. That didn't seem like a foregone conclusion that would happen. It seems to be happening. What that means in the long term, I'm not sure. What that means for California, I'm not sure. These are big states and they're dynamic and they have a lot of things going on. And I think you're seeing a concerted effort to try to revivify some of the entertainment industry in California, and maybe it'll work. Will the same thing work in Florida with the oranges? I don't know. We'll have to see.
Yeah. So, what drew you into these kind of extremely deep, like feature profile type stories that are sort of heavily tied to a specific place? Like, I think you've written about like Mexican avocado militias fighting against the cartels in Mexico. You've written about illegal logging in Romania. How did you get into all this?
Yeah, yeah, I know it's funny that the avocado story actually interestingly follows a sort of similar paradigm with the oranges in Florida. The avocado is much more of a Californian fruit, but um, becomes obviously very much this interesting Mexican development story. I don't know. I think that I think supply chains are really interesting, and I think that these yeah, these as the economy has become so global, there are these displacements that happen that can be really fascinating. And obviously, I guess all three of those things are about trees. So maybe I'm international tree correspondent at some level. But yeah, I think that, like, there's something sort of spectacular at some level about the way that these consumer products come to exist, and the social histories behind them I think are really compelling. And I'm lucky enough to have an editor here at Slate who's willing to spend the money to send me to check out some of that stuff and spend time with it and try to get really deep on it. And with the same is true of editors I've had at Harper's, where I did that avocado story, and the New Republic, where I did the thing about logging and IKEA. So I think this stuff's really fascinating. It's always a happy outcome when other people feel the same way. But yeah, it's been cool sort of to do that work, and interesting to see. Like, I've honestly, driving around Florida, I felt like lucky to see a few of these orange trees, that the few that are left. It's like it feels like an end of an era, and it's cool, to sort of appreciate that stuff, I think, before big changes do happen. And oftentimes things go one way, and then they change forever. And so yeah, I don't it's been cool work, and I appreciate you shouting it out.
Totally. Yeah. And final question is, what kind of stories are you looking at reporting on next?
It's a great question. My editor would also like to know the answer to that question. Um, I'm going to be doing a piece about. I might be doing two pieces about shoplifting. One I think will be about a package thieving ring here in Long Island in New York, and the other we'll sort of see if it comes together. But yeah, I think that shoplifting is the next thematic inquiry for me. So we'll see how long that takes to live, but hopefully it'll come together quickly.
Interesting. Yeah, it's a big trend, and in New York, San Francisco, and other places where you have to like ring a bell to get an employee to open the shampoo container for
Exactly.
you.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Alex Salmon, it's been great. I hope somehow, against all odds, the Florida citrus industry comes roaring back to life. That would be amazing.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, a big issue too. We didn't even touch on this, but like people don't really drink orange juice anymore, right? It's like it's sort of fallen out of favor on a consumer level. So it's like, if you have a stake in the orange juice industry, it's the time is now to go out and buy some juice. It's the high sugar, high calorie breakfast beverage has never been less popular. So you know,
I like eating the fruit.
there you go. Great.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on MTS.
Cool. Thanks, Theo. Appreciate it.
Of course, and we'll be right back in a minute to talk about the Musk v. Altman trial on day 5.